Hey everyone, so I never quit Edison, but for time zone reasons, I stopped competing because the tournament started at 1 a.m. for me. So there's basically no way I can ever compete, and what that really means is that I can't really refine any ideas I have about the format anymore because I'm limited to basic testing on the Edison ladder, which honestly is not really helpful in figuring out if things are good or bad due to the low level of technical play on the ladder. And since I can't really learn too much about Edison in my current situation, I'm releasing every single deck list I still use or play to this day. All deck lists will be downloadable in the description. There are 9 decks, so I'll be splitting this into 3 parts just so I don't upload a 2-hour video. The deck list will be in order from least avant-garde to most, so it'll start pretty basic and then get more teched out, I think. And then the last thing I'll say before I start is that I personally do not believe that deck building is static or that there's a perfect list for every deck. By definition, whenever you change a card in a deck list, there's going to be an opportunity cost associated with that card by including that card that you just put in because you had to remove a card to put a new card, so you lost the utility that the old card provided, or you lose a little bit of consistency by changing the math in your deck from going over 40. It would have to be a card with absolutely no synergy or utility in your deck to be removable with no detriment. So even if I made certain choices in my deck building, that does not mean I think that cards I didn't include in my list are unplayable or even bad at all. Okay, so the first deck is Diva Beat. One of my favorite decks in the format. I still think this is one of the best decks in Edison, honestly, and unfortunately compared to my last update, from the tournament I entered, I did have to cut my beloved Brain Control. It's not that Brain Control is bad, but when you side both the Cyber Dragons, you go from 6 conversions and potentially the Miracles to only 4 conversions and potentially the Miracles. The main is otherwise pretty standard. I don't play any of the -1s in my deck. There were lists in the past with discard traps, and yes, you do go so plus that you can afford discard traps in Diva Beat, but I don't actually want to discard any of my cards because they're all good cards. Yes, it's possible to discard Alias and then get some value from the Alias from Hero Blast, but another thing you could have done is summon the Alias, got value from the Alias, and then gotten more value from the Hero Blast. I also don't play Future Fusion or Call of the Haunted. I wrote a post in the Edison format server about why I don't play Future Fusion. You can just pause here if you want to read it. But I also don't play Call of the Haunted because Oppression completely obliterates Hero Beat. It's actually complete doomsday if you get Oppression with no out in Diva Beat, and I want to play as little cards that lose to Oppression as possible. Call of the Haunted also contributes to bricks, whether it's another combo card in a deck that plays a lot of combo cards, so it just felt like a little bit win more to me. For the extra deck, you have to play all 5 level 5s. This is the only thing I'm definitely confident about in the extra deck. I promise you, the second level 5 will come up more than whatever Thought Ruler or Colossal you think you're going to make will come up, because every single game you don't draw Gilman, and there's a matchup where one of the level 5s are better, you're going to need both. For example, against Blackwings, you're going to need both of the Androids, and against Lightsworn decks, you're going to need both of the Catasters. The main and the extra deck are pretty standard. The real thing I think is unique about my list are the 2 cards inside. First of all, Hero Beat struggles with decks that play value cards like Recruiters. It's an aggro deck that naturally pluses through combat, so you want to trade cards for damage, and then you can't really do that versus deck with Recruiters, so Banisher is the ultimate counter to those, such as Zombies or Fairies. It also helps versus Amaryllis and Dragon Turbo, which aren't free matchups either. Summoning Banisher and just getting a free +1 over Amaryllis is huge, especially when people aren't playing Burial to recur them anymore. And Dragon Turbo just can't efficiently answer normal summon Banisher turn 1 at all. The second card is Consecrated Light. This is the most OP card in the side deck. Bird decks are the most popular decks in the format, and yes, I know Hero Beat already has a good Blackwing matchup, but Blackwing is not a deck that can never beat Hero Beat. When they have Black Whirlwind, you are still losing, and that's when blowouts like Consecrated Light are really good. The other matchup where it's really good is Vayu. I don't really know how this happened, but there's like this misconception that Consecrated Light is not good versus Vayu, and to an extent I agree, because in some decks I think that is true. For example, the decks that are currently citing Consecrated Light are like Quick Draw or Fairies, and those decks that get one-shot by Deck Devastation Virus, which means that your side will just lose to their side if you both see your side. And that was always really confusing to me because like you could just be citing Consecrated Light in decks that don't lose to Deck Devastation Virus at all. Specifically aggro decks such as Hero Beat and Gladiator Beast, which is what I've been doing to great success. Not only do these decks not lose to Deck Devastation Virus, but they naturally discourage your opponent from citing Fossil Dyna because it's a free +1 in combat, which means that's another out that Consecrated Light can't really be killed by. Really, the only threats you need to watch out for are Raikou, Card Trooper, or the Cyber Dragon if they're even playing that. But let's say they do have a Raikou. First of all, I always thought this was a really weird line of reasoning because it's not like anyone ever says, what if Frog activates Soul Exchange on your Vanity's Fiend? These decks are good because they have outs to blowouts, but that doesn't make the blowout bad. The second reason is that Vayu as a deck cannot actually hold the Raikou in hand to out a Consecrated Light based on how the matchup naturally operates. Let's say you do a basic Diva Beat opener of normal summon Stratos, set some back rows, and then let's say your opponent opens 2 plays. They can either set a Raikou, or they can summon a Grepher and then summon an Armwing, or do some dark component stuff. Naturally, they're going to want to set Raikou because it's better for their sequencing. If they summon Grepher, summon Armed Wing, and you have a stop for the Armed Wing such as Bottomless or Compulse or Deep Prison, then they lose the Armed Wing, and then they're going to lose the Grepher in battle next turn. And then you're also going to have to spend the following turn to set the Raikou after already taking damage, which means that you're essentially playing 4 cards to 7, which usually means that you've completely lost. So the better play is usually to set Raikou, hit the back row so that your Armed Wing can get free +1s in combat after you've grinded through all the back rows. It's also better because the Raikou can mill a component, which gives your Grepher more information on the send. So Vayu needs to sequence the Raikous first, or else their risk reward in the matchup is just really messed up. So what you do in the matchup from the Hero Beat side is to clear the Raikous early, and then you drop Consecrated Light in the simplified game state, and then they're dead. You can't even get reversal by Dark Armed or Burial or Return anymore. And I could make an entire video on Consecrated Light, honestly, because I think this card is really underrated, especially when you're siding it in aggro decks, like I said earlier, such as Hero Beat and Gladiator Beast, and like Machina in decks such as those. The second deck is Vayu Turbo. If Diva Beat was one of my favorite decks in the format, then the next two are two of my least favorite decks. But they are meta, so I have to play them in order to understand how they work. This is pretty much a very standard list. All Vayu lists are almost the same 40. You have to choose between playing Second Hamster or Chargeable Light Brigade. There are also decisions to be made between playing Oppression main, or playing Chaos Sorcerer in the list, or playing the third Sirocco versus the Necrogardnia or the third Caius. I tested pretty much all of these things and they were fine, but I pretty much chose what I believe to be the most value. Because just on a personal basis, I like to build my decks for card advantage and consistency typically, at the cost of card activity. So my lists tend to have more normal summons a lot of the time. Sometimes it's bad because you can die to a push turn because you lack defense, or you die with too many normals in your hand, or you're just getting out-tempoed. But in a lot of those game states, the third Deep Prison isn't really helping me that much anyways. The math on playing the third Sirocco is really good. You get 5% greater mill odds in the early game, assuming you don't draw them. But I tested with 40 cards and third Sirocco, and I wasn't really milling a lot of materials anyways. Factually speaking, it is unlucky, but I ended up just drawing a lot of materials since I was playing 8 of them. So I just chose to go back down to 7 and stay at 40. There's really only 4 things maybe even weird about this list. The first one is third Caius, and I think a lot of people say that third Caius bricks because you don't support tributes that well. And I kind of agree in theory, but I just do not draw multiple Caiuses that often, even if you do the math. A really annoying thing about the Vayu matchup is that the mirror match is kind of bad, and a lot of the early game is just testing for Caius to see if they have it, or to force it out if they do have it, and then you just want to pass the test as often as possible. I also play every single optional way to support Caius, including the Reaper, the second Hamster, the Necrogardna, and the Scrap Iron Scarecrow. And also the third Caius is, in a way, a good way to beat some really annoying things that Vayu struggles with, such as Stardust with back row. The second card is Icarus Attack. Yes, I do have it over Solemn, but that does not mean I think Solemn is bad. I actually think Solemn is a very good card. The thing I don't like about Solemn is that Solemn to me feels like a card that doesn't really interact that well with HRC. And HRC is very popular because it's a counter trap, which means it's direct timing counterplay. So if you don't set the Solemn, you're losing value on the Solemn because they can establish a threat when you keep it in hand, or you're forced to set it early if you want the value, but that puts you in threat of Raikou getting pluses. I think Solemn is a better card than most people do, especially in Vayu. But I preferred Icarus because I think its being removal into established boards was too valuable, because Vayus tend to have a little bit of a problem of playing into established boards. The third card is Scrap Iron Scarecrow. I've pretty much only seen this card being played in Zombies or Amaryllis, and I can kind of see why. It guarantees you win the Floater or Recruiter interaction in battle, but I never thought it was that good in Zombies because if they attacked a Floater, it was good for you anyways. And Deep Prison was kind of the same thing, except you actually removed their monster. The deck I always thought Scrap Iron was super insane in was Vayu, because Vayu is a deck with a lot of extremely bad cards. And that might sound crazy, but it's cards such as Vayu or Plague or Necrogardna, basically components you have to commit that are extremely bad plays if you commit them. Like, you're just taking a -1 in battle so you can recover the neg later from your graveyard, and you only had to do this because you drew the components and without a conversion such as Grepher and not one of your good cards. And these situations do happen a lot because there's 5 pretty bad components, and I would also say 4 of them in particular are really bad components. Plague sometimes is okay to draw if you just use it as a tuner monster. So why am I not playing Deep Prison? Negating an attack is cool and all, but doesn't Deep Prison just directly kill their monster? Well, yes, that's true, but the thing is, if you Deep Prison them, protecting your component monster doesn't actually do anything, because Vayu only has one way to convert them, which is Caius. So if you Deep Prison their monster, then you just can't Caius them because their monster is already banished. But if you Scrap Iron them, then their monster is just stuck there ready for your Caius to get that delicious +1. Or it's technically a +0, but your component was basically a -1, so you just recovered the neg and got positioning. And also, it starts threatening their back row just naturally based on how the set dynamic works against Vayu. Because if you just set a back row that isn't chainable, then it is actually a Raikou, then you just went -1 for free. The final card is Starlight Road sided. This is maybe a little bit weird, but it's for Blackwings. People like to say that Vayu beats Blackwings, and maybe that's true. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just not super confident either way, but the point is that Vayu can potentially lose to Blackwings, because Blackwing is a deck that can beat everyone. Normally, Starlight Road is a card that isn't that good against Blackwings because it's high variance since they can oppression your road. But Vayu is the best oppression deck in the format without an exception, so they cannot keep the oppression in against Vayu. There's just no way. Which means that Road ends up being a crush. Maybe Blackwing can beat a Road by Bryoing the Stardust or something versus slower decks, but Blackwing will 100% lose every single game they go -2 into Road, and then your Stardust deals 2500 damage to them next to your other pressure because they use their Icarus attack defensively on your turn. The third deck for this video is going to be Dragon Turbo. This is my absolute least favorite deck of the format, and I hope we get Advanced Edison soon so we can kill this deck. There's a couple different ways you can build Dragon Turbo, but my personal philosophy was building for number 1, consistency, and number 2, the OTK. I don't really believe in building specifically for grind with this deck. You can do that, but generally the cards that, in my opinion, help you grind are the Giga Rejuvenation turns, where you're just playing up a ton of cards because you got free pluses from free draws, and then you access your searches and your sweepers. So Dragon Turbo in general is a pretty solid deck. These 26 cards on top are cards that you must play in Dragon Turbo because they're just the consistency cards in every single deck. So I'm only going to explain the last 14 cards. The next 5 cards are utility cards that you must play or else you get into game states where it's impossible to win, which leaves the last 7 cards. Basically, I wanted to minimize utility cards that cause you to brick, but might help you in certain grind games like Gores or Mirror Force or Torrential in favor of cards that help you draw. So for the main deck, these are the debatable things that you can do, but there's a Trooper debate. Do you play Vortex Trooper or do you play Card Trooper? So the reason I chose Vortex Trooper is because Vortex Trooper is better when you brick, because if you brick and summon Card Trooper, and then you just mill your spells and traps that you need to unbrick because they're all in your deck because your hand has all your bricks. So it doesn't really matter which one you play as long as you play one of them to have level 3 access for Black Rose Dragon. But I think Vortex Trooper is better for bricked games, and I'm trying to build to minimize the amount of games I brick. And also, this is a silly reason, but sometimes you can 50-50 to fix your Pot of Avarice if it's in the bottom 2 cards of your deck, because otherwise you are going to auto-lose every single game if Pot of Avarice is in the bottom 2 cards of your deck, assuming you had to discard some of your red MDs, which happens a lot because sometimes you need to activate MSC in order to draw, or sometimes you needed to activate card destruction at some point and red MD is already in your hand. The second debate is between Reckless Grade and cards that are more utility, such as Gores or Giant Trunade or Second Pot of Avarice. And in my opinion, these cards are just completely unnecessary because if you open 3 utility cards, then you will lose every single game you open 3 utility cards. The rest of your hand has to be like Future Fusion and then like a bunch of trade-ins or something. Your hand just won't have enough draw cards to actually efficiently draw enough of your deck. Drawing 3 utility cards when Super Rejuvenation isn't involved is also a loss. You don't even have to open them, even if 3 of them just come into your hand at an early timing before you draw enough of your deck. So if you don't play Reckless, you probably play Gores, Treacherous Trap Hole, and Trunade, in my opinion. Those are the cards that I would replace Reckless Greed with. But Gores isn't needed because Trag is bigger, which means it blocks her OTKs better. And then it's a less conditional blocker also because a lot of the time you need to set your hand during the end phase so you don't discard off of Super Rejuvenation. And you also only need 1 blocker to survive the push before you OTK, which is why I don't think you play Gores. Sometimes you can summon a Gores if they attack really poorly into it because they're kind of forced to put Dragon Turbo on a clock. But generally, none of the good decks in the format are just going to get soloed by Gores. If in those games, you're probably going to win anyways. To discuss more of my utility cards, Prime Material in Dragon in the main deck might be a little bit weird, but it enables Trident Dragon without instant fusion. And it also lets you get to Quackimera Drago because otherwise you have a hard time to get to the other body for the second Red MD. Because you have to Red MD for one of the debris targets, which means then you special a second one that got banished, and then you have to banish your Red MD in order to have enough damage to summon the Drago to OTK through Gores. Basically, it just makes your Trident Dragon line need an extra card. It's not a massive brick because it's still treated as a dragon for Super Rejuvenation, and it also gives your Future Fusion 5 clean dumps, because at the current moment, if you don't main deck Prime Material Dragon, then you have to send your Flamvel Guard, assuming you didn't draw any of the cards you want to send off to Future Fusion. I only play 1 Instant Fusion. The original Hydro Pump and Pro Storm lists also only played 1 Instant Fusion, but I think 2 is probably what's played in every single deck now. Playing two of them lets you more freely use your Bryanak in the early game just to discard your hand for super rejuvenation, and it also lets you play on their viruses. I didn't really want to increase my brick chance by any means, so I wanted to minimize utility as much as possible, and that did unfortunately mean I had to cut the second instant fusion. But only playing one instant fusion does make you a little bit weaker to viruses. I also chose to main Lightning Vortex, because if you play an original Ghost Rider list, if you don't main deck Lightning Vortex, which he doesn't, you are going to automatically lose every single game where they summon Christia or Vanity's Fiend, and I really did not like to auto-lose free matchups. And also, it just makes your OTKs much easier, because otherwise, your deck has a really hard time OTKing into certain decks, for example, any boards that involve Absolute Zero, because in those situations, you either need to spend your normal summon in order to Black Rose nuke the board first, or in my list, you can just summon a Prime Material Dragon, but even in those situations, it just costs you more cards. The last two cards are just Tragodia, so you don't get OTK'd after your Super Rejuvenation turn, and Flambeau cards, so you can Brya with priority. And it's also not really a brick since this one's a Dragon Tuner, so I did think it was worth playing. For the extra deck, fives. This is the thing that's probably a bit more unique about my deck, is that I think Android is the better card if I could only pick one, but I do play both. Originally, I played neither because you don't really use them to OTK, but sometimes you need to be able to use Stone to make a Synchro to search for Blue Eyes, and it's better to make Android than Armory Arm. Sometimes you don't have Armory Arm access, and it's also better to make Android than Catastor in a lot of situations. Let's say you Trag copy level 4, and then you make Magical Android. In end phase, you gain 600, and then let's say they Caius your Android and attack direct. In that case, you only took 1800 damage. But if you had to make Catastor because it was the only 5 you could make, and then you got Caius, then you're taking 3400 damage, which is a massive 1600 life point differential. Tempest Magician and Musician King are only for time, because this is my real life deck, so you should probably cut these for Stardust Dragon and Ancient Fairy Dragon if you're playing online or for timeless events. So some cards I'm not playing are Ojama Knight, because I only play one Instant Fusion, and I've never had the Debris line come up with 2 Instant Fusion. So Mariner is a better card between Ojama Knight and Mariner, because it's a water instead of a light, which means that you can summon it under Quacky Mirror Drago, and it's pretty much always just summonable no matter any circumstance. The second one is Darkfire Dragon. To be honest, I've never played the second Darkfire Dragon even when I had second Instant Fusion, but I can see situations if it comes up, I've never needed it personally. You can use it if you Instant Fusion and then MSC and then the Instant Fusion comes back, but I always play for kills, so they don't really live after the first Darkfire Dragon I use. The next one is Stardust Dragon. This is just a card, like, I do play Ancient Fairy Dragon and Stardust Dragon when I play in online tournaments, but I've never made Stardust Dragon before. The only line I ever see in Ghost Rider's first place replay is to drop against Hero Beat early, but otherwise Ancient Fairy Dragon to Stardust Dragon line is pretty fragile. Like, for example, every single deck can break it with just Brain Control and then Caius. Like, Brain Caius will just kill you because then you have no more resources because you already spent them all in order to go for this Ancient Fairy Dragon line. And also, I main deck Prime Material Dragon, so I just don't really need the Stardust Dragon in general. But I would play Ancient Fairy Dragon and Stardust, as I said earlier, over Musician King and Tempest Magician if you're playing online and there's no time involved. The last card is Ancient Sacred Wyvern. It's because sometimes you don't have enough spells and traps for Trident Dragon, and Ancient Sacred Wyvern will let you kill through 2 Upstart Dragons with 2 Red MD, or 7800 with 1 Red MD. It happened once when I was walled with a 2k Defender, but it's pretty hard to take 0 damage and also have a kill, so I opted not to play it. For the side, as usual, I think my main deck and extra deck are pretty normal. It's my side where I think the list is more innovative. One of the biggest strengths about Dragon Turbo, in my opinion, are that you can side the strongest side deck cards in the entire format at 1 copy and then just draw into them and blow them out. And that's why if you see them, I have a ton of 1-of cards. It's pretty obvious what they do, so I'll just say what matchups they're for. Cyber Dragon is for machines, but this is definitely the 15th card in the side deck, and if I need something else, then this is going out. But sometimes I do play against machines, and I still die to Limiter with Cyber Dragon in my hand. But it's also not the worst card to relieve some pressure in aggro matchups, and it does survive deck dev. Although if you're getting deck dev, then the Cyber Dragon is definitely not helping you survive 3 turns. The second Quacky Mirror Drago is weirdly not for dark decks. Like, I don't bring it for Drago, but I bring it for frogs and decks with battle stops like Battle Fader, Gores, and Tragodia, because you don't want to have your 1 Drago crowed or soul released against frogs, and then you can never win. 2 Consecrated are for Blackwings and Norlaris. This time I don't really bring them against Vayu because unlike Hero Beat, they will be bringing in Deck Devastation Virus, and you can't protect the Consecrated Lights because you don't play any Battle Traps. So sometimes even Blackwings just run them over with Dyna, but the Blackwing matchup is really hard, so I just wanted to maximize odds of stalling them. Even if sometimes, yes, you do just get run over by Dyna. Crow is for alt-win like the Dragon Turbo Mirror or Norlaris, which is an extremely bad matchup, and you can also bring it against Vayu to relieve some pressure and also stop yourself from getting put into Deck Devastation Virus situations. The second Lightning Vortex is for Frog and Hero decks, also Plant decks because it helps you kill them without using your normal summon. The next one is Prohibition. This is mostly for Hero Beat, I'd say, because you can just call Alias, but honestly you can play this against a lot of other decks such as Frog as well. The Mask of Restrict is for Frog, because Dragon Turbo is really good against Frog, but it does a lot worse against Frogs that have Light and Darkness Dragon, and Light and Darkness Dragon is starting to become more popular. Light Imprisoning Mirror is for Lightsworns and Fairy decks. Shadow Imprisoning Mirror is for Vayu, Norlaris, and Zombies. You do have to be careful because you need to draw Heavy Storm before you kill them whenever you activate Shadow Imprisoning Mirror, so it makes your OTK line a bit more specific. Or you can just Bryo bounce your own Shadow Imprisoning Mirror, but that's like a bit different. There's two oppressions because your hardest matchups in the entire format are Instant Fusion, Zombies, Gladiator Beasts, X-Sabers, and Norlaris, and Oppression is good against all of them except for Norlaris. And it's also just a good card against the format in general, like against plants and these decks that honestly you should pretty much always auto-win against these decks, but it still makes them even more guaranteed. It's unfortunately similar to Shadow Imprisoning Mirror, where you need to heavy this card away before you win the game. And this card you can't even Bryo it away. You actually absolutely must Heavy Storm this card away. The next two cards are two Decrees. This is for Hero Beat and Blackwings. They're your second and third Heavy Storm. These cards help you win the game through sided cards because otherwise you have a bit of a problem with Starlight Road. And then lastly, this is just a Torrential because it's the best sweeper in the format in my opinion. I typically always bring this in because post-board there's also more monsters you need to remove like Vanity's Fiend. I also want to talk about some other cards I cited before. The first one is Giant Trunade. I had this for the longest time and it's in every single Dragon Turbo deck I see online, but I think this card is just not needed at all. Normally you play Giant Trunade to beat Road, but Decree already beats Road and is better in an actual grind game. Giant Trunade is a -1 and is used strictly for the OTK, which makes it 4th Heavy Storm or 3rd Decree. And at that point, you just draw redundant cards, especially when it increases the amount of utility cards in your deck by such a significant margin, and as I said earlier, drawing 3 utility cards is almost a guaranteed loss. The next card is Super Polymerization. I played Absolute Zero in my extra deck for this. Honestly, it was good against Frogs and Hero Beat, but I just didn't want to lose to those decks in my testing, so it wasn't relevant. Imperial Ironwall, this was similar to other Floodgates. You have to heavy it before you kill them, but it's good against a lot of decks such as Vayu and also Hero decks, but it just didn't make the cut because I felt like you could side other better cards for it against those decks. You could cut the Cyber Dragon for it, but then your extra deck gets a little bit redundant as well because you don't want to draw too many Floodgates either. And then the last card I want to talk about is Mind Control because you can play it versus Absolute Zero or Raikou decks or other Dragon decks. Trap Dragon decks are just not played at all. Like, I'm not making a value statement on how good that Trap Dragon deck is. I'm just saying that it's not played by the general population, which means that you would be siding a card for a very narrow matchup. And also, usually they have a Drago next to the red MD, so you can't actually do anything with the Mind Control. And also, Absolute Zero has better solutions, but it's not good. I never understood siding Mind Control or Nobleman of Crossout or any of these cards because Raikou against Dragon Turbo is a complete meme. Or excuse me, it's not a complete meme because you definitely would not side out your Raikous against Dragon Turbo because they do a couple of things that are really good by letting you commit into Gores or Trag Safer, or you can force Reckless Greed early, or you can snipe their utility cards that they set because they don't want to discard for Super Rejuvenation. But there's no way you should be concerned about Raikou as a Dragon Turbo player. Like, the threats to Dragon Turbo are dying early, not these fair 1-for-1 trades that take 2 turns to resolve. You can just wait for them to commit and then black res the board for infinite value if you're really afraid of something like Raikou. Like I said in the intro, I don't think my list is perfect because you will lose to random things based on how I built. For example, if they play Starlight Road, then they will probably win because then you're playing into Stardust plus back row. If they have Solemn and Depression and you don't have MSC, then you will also lose. I had a tournament match against Vayu once where I drew my entire deck, but I had to use both my MSCs in order to do it. So if they opened both Solemn and Depression, I would lose, and they did. You also lose to these super strong Floodgate monsters, and since I built for more combo, you have less outs in general. But overall, I think the situations you lose to are too narrow to justify playing cards that brick super often when you open them. But yeah, those are just the first 3 decks I'm revealing. Next time I make an Edison video, both my Blackwing decks will be in there, and also my zombie list will be in there.